Muscle is the third type of tissue that we have. So we've already talked about epithelial tissue and connective tissue. So, um, connective tissue, remember, was the most diverse and there were so many different subtypes of it. So be sure that you're aware of those. For muscle, it's a little simpler. There's only three types of muscle tissue. They're composed of muscle fibers, as you could probably guess. And the result of the shortening is movement. So they move all kinds of things. They move bones, that would be skeletal muscle. They move blood and food, and that would be smooth muscle. And then the last type of muscle tissue is cardiac muscle, which of course is only found in the heart. So the first one that we're going to look at here is skeletal muscle. And notice that they are long cells, they're cylindrical, they're striated fibers, and they have multiple nuclei in their periphery. So we call them multinucleated. The other important characteristic to know about skeletal muscle is that they are voluntarily controlled, so they require us consciously deciding to contract them. The nervous system has to send them a signal. They're attached to the bone or the skin. So tendons, for example, anchor the muscles to the bones. When we look at the histology a little closer, you can see a skeletal muscle fiber here with many nuclei, and I'll draw an arrow around one of these cells to show you how large they are. So they have multiple nuclei. This micrograph below here highlights one individual skeletal muscle fiber. Our next type of muscle tissue is cardiac muscle tissue. It is a branching network of fibers. And a lot of times they're actually Y-shaped the way they are branched. They are also striated. They're autorhythmic, so they initiate their own contraction. I mean, thankfully, in the morning, we don't have to wake up and tell our cardiac muscle to contract, thankfully. They are attached to end by very strong structures called intercalated discs. And what this connection allows is for chemicals to pass very quickly from one cell to another. So I'd like you to take a look at the histology here, where the black arrow is that I'm drawing. Those are the intercalated discs that you see. Notice they go in the same direction as the striations as well, but there's not as many intercalated discs as there are striations. So they cause movement of the blood, and they're found in the heart, specifically the wall of the heart called the myocardium, which you'll learn about later on in the semester when we cover the heart. The last type of muscle tissue is smooth muscle tissue. It's relatively short, but it's wide in the middle and tapered at the ends. So it kind of has this general shape of being tapered at the end, as you can see here. It's not striated, so it's the only muscle tissue that does not have those striations, and it's involuntarily controlled. So when it contracts, it moves things like food through the GI tract. It moves blood through the cardiovascular system, and finally sperm through the reproductive system. So like the vas deferens, the epididymis, for example, in the male reproductive system have smooth muscle. And it's in the walls of most internal organs, like the stomach, intestines, bladder, and the blood vessel walls. The last type of tissue that's present is nervous tissue. And the two types of cells in nervous tissue are neurons as well as glial cells. The nerve cells are the main cells which are capable of initiating and conducting an electrical current throughout the body. They have three distinct parts to them. The first of which is really the dendrite, because that's what receives the signal. So, and they're both cellular processes. And sometimes it's difficult to differentiate between the axon and the dendrite, but the dendrite conducts the signal towards the cell body. The cell body is where the nucleus is found. It's also called the soma. And then finally, the axon is going to take the signal away from the soma. The glial cells are supporting cells that protect the neurons. So it's all you need to know about them right now. So there's this slide showing the nuclei of the glial cells. Again, the cell processes could be dendrites or axons. The majority of them are dendrites. The glial cells, you will be learning more about them later on in the semester when we cover the nervous system. But for now, this tissue is found in the brain, spinal cord, and the nerves. Body membranes are also included in this chapter, and they actually fit with epithelium. We're going to talk about them here. These body membranes line major body cavities and cover organ surfaces. There's 3 different body membranes, and we're going to talk about, or really 4 membranes. Actually, there's 3 main ones. The first 2 that we're going to talk about are mucous membranes and serous membranes, both of which are wet membranes. The mucous membranes open to the external environment. So if we think about the digestive system, the beginning and the end of the digestive system would have mucous membranes. The beginning of the respiratory system, the opening of the reproductive system, as well as the urethra, for example, and the urinary system. They have epithelium in them, underlying connective tissue. And that epithelium, a lot of times, is going to be columnar in shape, but it definitely can vary. The serous membrane would be the next type of wet membrane. And these are membranes that do not open up to the organ surface or open up to the external environment. So they're different than mucous membranes. And they're inside the ventral cavity. Remember, the ventral cavity is subdivided into the thoracic cavity. Inside the thoracic cavity is the heart and the lungs. Surrounding the heart is the pericardium, and surrounding the lungs is the pleura. And then there is a double-layered membrane, which produces serous fluid that reduces the friction between the 2 layers. The deep layer around the organ is the visceral layer, and the superficial layer is the parietal layer. So, for example, the visceral pericardium is around the heart. The visceral pleura would be touching the lungs. And then the visceral peritoneum in the abdominal pelvic cavity would be directly touching the organs. The superficial layer would be the parietal layer. The last 2 membranes are the cutaneous membrane, which is a dry membrane. So it's essentially the skin. So it would be the epidermis and the dermis. It's the largest of the membranes, and it consists of a type of epithelium that you've already learned, keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, which is, of course, the dermis, or I'm sorry, the epidermis. The epidermis is connective tissue, which is deep to the epidermis. And then finally, the last of the membranes is the synovial membrane, which lines the cavities of some joints. And there is synovial fluid that's produced that helps to kind of nourish that cavity. So it's well vascularized, areolar, fibrous, and adipose connective tissue all together.